Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Rahman Tutorials. In this video we are going to learn about heredity and evolution part 2. At the end of this lesson you will be able to define evolution, explain the mechanism of evolution, define variation, explain the mechanism of evolutionary changes, define species, define speciation, describe the process of speciation. Evolution is defined as any genetic change in a population that is inherited over several generations. Now, the question is in what manner these genetic differences passed on. Some researchers believed life developed in a linear fashion from simple forms to complex forms. Charles Robert Darwin had a different theory on evolution. He set an voyage, observed various species of life on Earth, and put forward the idea of evolution of species by natural selection. Darwin compared the emergence of new species to the branching of a tree. He said that the species inherit its character from its ancestor. To understand evolution, let's look at some examples. These are two different beetle populations. Both these species of beetles usually feed on the leaves of a particular bush. We will see which of these beetle population is an example of evolution. The bush gets infested with the disease and the amount of leaf material available to the beetles is reduced. So, during the course of generation, the average weight of the beetles decreases. When the plant disease is eliminated, the average weight of the beetles return to normal. Since the change is not inherited over generations, this is not an example of evolution. Now, look at this sample population of two types of beetles. Around 90% beetles are green and 10% beetles are brown. This means 90% have genes that provide the color green and 10% have genes that provide the color brown. Generations later, this is what the sample population looks like. Brown beetles make up about 70% of the population. These two generations of the same population genetically different, showing an evolutionary change. Changes in genes of color variation occur and are inherited over generation. So this is an example of evolution. Evolution requires genetic variation. Variation is the difference among individuals of species caused by genetic and environmental factors. Let us discuss this with the same beetle example. A green beetle population turning into brown beetles through an evolutionary change is called a mutation. A mutation is the change in the sequence of nitrogen base pairs in the DNA. A mutation in a gene for gene coloration in green beetles lead to offspring with brown coloration. There may be a situation where some brown beetles join a population of green beetles. This is called migration. Breeding between the brown and green beetles introduces new gene combination to the population. This movement of gene from brown beetle to green beetles is called gene flow. Let us consider a slightly different situation. A population of green and brown beetles is crawling on the leaves of a bush when a bird appeared. Brown beetles are more visible on the bushes than green beetles, so the bird is more likely to feed on them. Green beetles, which are likely to survive, will bear the responsibility of producing offspring. They will pass their genes for the green coloration of their offspring. Therefore, the green beetle is better adapted to the environment than the brown beetle. This is a process in which organisms are best suited to their environment is called natural selection. Now, let's talk about another situation. In sample of green and brown beetle, several green beetles are killed when a man steps on the bushes where the beetles are feeding. This results in a greater number of brown beetles in the next generation. So, accidents in small population can change the frequency of some genes in a population. This genetic variation in small population caused by environmental factor is called genetic drift. Let's see how the speciation happens. Before that, let's understand what is species. Take a look at the spiders. Each spider look different, but they are all able to interbreed. A species is defined as a group of individuals that can interbreed in nature. Thus, we can say that these spiders belong to the same species. Speciation is an event that splits the population into two independent species which cannot reproduce with each other. Let's see a simplified scenario of speciation by geographic isolation. Here is a population of beetles laying eggs on bananas. If a hurricane strikes the mainland and the bananas with the beetle eggs on them are washed away to the island, it is called genetic drift. The beetles hatch out of the eggs and mature on the island. Ecological conditions are slightly different on the island as compared to the mainland. This leads to a change in morphology and food preferences in the beetles over the course of generations. In case another storm occurs, the beetles from the island may get washed back to the mainland. However, the beetles will not breed with the mainland beetles any longer since they evolved different behavioral characteristics by now. The few that do mate with the mainland beetles produce inviable eggs because of the genetic differences between the two populations. The lineage has split now. Genes cannot flow between the populations anymore. This process is referred as to speciation. Millions of years ago on Earth lived huge gigantic animals called dinosaurs. In the process of evolution, all these huge gigantic animals became extinct, using the remnants of these dead animals to compare against the characteristic of existing animals. Evolutionary relationships were developed. This is how we came to know about the existence of dinosaurs. However, there are several other pieces of evidences of evolution that suggest a link between the different species. In this lesson, you will learn about evolutionary relationship and human evolution. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to define homologous characteristics, define analogous characteristics, analyze the tracing of evolutionary relationship with examples, explain the tracing of human evolution, define a fossil, identify the methods used to find the age of fossils. Characteristics are the hereditary traits transmitted from parent to their offspring. They can be related to particular behavior or appearance. For example, we have four limbs. That's a characteristic. Preparation of food through photosynthesis is a basic characteristic of plant. Characteristic in four related organisms will be similar because they have inherited from common ancestor. Such characteristics are called homologous characteristics. For example, mammals, birds, reptiles and amphibians have four limbs with same the basic limb layout because they have inherited the limbs from the common ancestor. These limbs have been modified to perform different functions. However, all similarities in animals are not necessarily because of a common ancestry. Let's consider the example of bats and birds. These two animals have wings, but if you take an example of squirrels and lizards, they do not have wings. From this, we can conclude that birds and bats are more closely related to each other when compared to squirrels and lizards. The wings of the bats have skin folds stretched between elongated fingers, whereas the wings of birds are feathery, covering the arm entirely. The design of the two wings looks similar because both of them have a common purpose to fly. The structure and components, however, are different. Therefore, although their origin is not common, they serve similar function. This makes analogous characteristic rather than homologous characteristics. This homologous characteristics and analogous characteristics help us to trace evolutionary relationships. They are evidence of evolution. Studies on characteristics are not only conducted on current species but also done on the species that are now extinct. How can we know that an extinct species ever existed? When an organism dies, it gets decomposed and leaves behind remnants in the soil. These traces of living organisms are known as fossils. Let's illustrate the process of fossilization of an ammonite. On its death, an ammonite sinks to the sea floor. Scavengers feed on the fleshy body, and all that remains is the shell. Gradually, the ammonite shell is covered with salts and sand. After a few hundred years, the shell gets buried several feet beneath the surface of the earth. Gradually, the shell decays and what remains is the rock-like copy of the original shell. This is exposed when the rock is eroded by wind, water, ice, or by activities of paleontologists. Let's take a look at various fossils. Fossil trilobite, an invertebrate animal. Fossil fish, fossil tree trunk, the dinosaur skull. This fossil was found only a few years ago in the Narmada Valley. Mary Anning found the specimen of Ichthyosaurus and was the first fossilist. Evolution doesn't happen overnight. It is a process which takes place in stages, and the process often converges towards development of a specific organ. For example, complicated organ like eye was not generated by a single DNA change. The eye was formed over generation, starting from the intermediate integumentary eye in planaria to well-complexed eye in vertebrates like human beings. All of these changes in response to adaptation to the environment. For example, the eyes of the octopus and the eyes of the vertebrate have evolved entirely independently. These similarities of structure, despite of different origins, provide a classic example of biological convergence. A property that is characteristics of particular animal may post-evolution be useful for performing a totally different function. For example, long feathers were considered for providing insulation to cold weather. Some reptiles like dinosaurs have feathers, but very few were adopted for flying. In the present day, birds use feathers for flying, which is an example of adaptation. This means birds are closely related to reptiles. Thus, we can say that adaptation is an evidence of evolution. There are also many characteristics to prove evolutionary relationship in plants. In the present scenario, farmers use plants with desirable characteristics to produce new varieties by a process called artificial selection. Farmers has descended all these vegetables from a wild cabbage ancestor. Short distances between leaves gave rise to a new variety, cabbage. Arrested flower development gave rise to new variety, broccoli. Sterile flowers give rise to the cauliflower. Swollen part give rise to kohlrabi, and the larger leaf give rise to leafy vegetable kale. These changes occur due to changes in gene which accumulate over a period of time. The tools for tracing evolutionary relationship like excavating, time dating, studying fossil, and determining DNA sequences have been used for studying human evolution. All humans are single species. The earliest member of human species or Homo sapiens are traced to Africa. A couple of 100,000 years ago, some of our ancestors left Africa and slowly spread across the planet. It resulted in stopping the gene flow, and over time it led to the evolution of different races. It is very crucial to understand certain things in tracing evolutionary relationships. Firstly, multiple branches are possible at each and every stage. For example, it is not true that human beings evolved from chimpanzees. Instead, both human beings and chimpanzees had a common ancestor. Changes in DNA during reproduction are the basic events in evolution. Comparing the DNA of different species allows us to estimate how much the DNA has changed during the formation of species. In fact, there is no real progress in the idea of evolution. Evolution is simply the generation of diversity and shaping of the diversity by environmental selection. The only progressive trend in evolution seems to be that more and more complex body designs have emerged over time. However, many old and simple designs still survived. For example, one of simple forms of bacteria is able to survive in almost all climatic conditions such as hot springs, deep sea, thermal events, and in Antarctica. In other words, human beings are not the height of evolution but simply yet another species in the clouded spectrum of evolving life.